Okay, so there are going to be two quick fire sessions now. The first is just thinking about green industrialization, which I'm going to frame in the moment. And then Travis is going to stay on stage and do a presentation of the work that they're doing at the Fletcher School, which I think will be helpful to us. So this first session is meant to be a bit of an experiment here, a fireside chat to be quite quick. But the framing that I wanted to kind of give it is, and I did mention this a little bit earlier on, is we think about demand-side assumptions and models. We make some wild assumptions, like really crazy assumptions. And I think I mentioned earlier the case that I'd seen in Kenya where they had 12 gigawatts of total demand, of which half of that was data centers and hydrogen electrolyzers, right? Very unrealistic scenario, but also for those of you energy modelers in the room, imagine trying to manage a system where a gigawatt of demand drops. It's like 20% of your 12% of your energy system just vanishes. Like that would be a very difficult grid to manage. So we want to think a lot more carefully about that long-term demand side. And I think the point that was made on the panel earlier, the other big challenge is the pipeline. What are we kind of investing in? And so we're very narrow about how we think about pipelines, and we tend to fixate on big things. Big, easy things to understand. Electric vehicles, hydrogen, batteries, right? It's something that you can easily conceptualize. The challenge of thinking about long-term light industrialization, the informal sector, like how do we do that? That's kind of what we want to talk about in this panel, and we've got a perspective from the developing economy through Nimrod, and Nimrod is the Nimrod that Mark referred to in his earlier presentation, and is currently at the UCT, it's the Nelson Mandela School of Governance, is that right? But also used to be a practitioner in the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition in South Africa for many years, was a DDG. I won't say how many years, but it was a good amount of time, and has had to deal with the practicalities of this. How do you do it? What are the political challenges? And then for a developed country perspective, Travis has worked in the broader, particularly the Fletcher School, have done a lot of work in economic diversification and thinking about how the IRA might work in the United States. And so also having the same kind of debate, right? How do you industrialize or reindustrialize these big developed economies? That's the kind of very quick framing. And Nimrod's going to kick us off with a couple of thoughts, particularly I think on this question of like how do we think about this and what are the sort of methodological approaches. So thank you, Nimrod.
Great. Well, thanks very much. I'm going to present from up here just because it'll be easier. So obviously there's not an awful amount of time, and I'm going to try and time myself and not take more than an hour, because I know that otherwise Steve will get nervous. So really I have two slides. The first slide talks to a piece of work that we initiated at the school last year, which resulted in insights that have come out from a group of green industrial development experts that we convened. And the second tries to zoom in then on how some of these issues play out in the South African economy, with a particular focus on how these things can be quantified, even if not through some of the much more impressive modeling tools that you guys have been presenting, but at least through some kind of rootedness in empiricism. So very high level picture that comes out of this Green Industrial Development Expert Panel, which is a panel that is co-convened by ourselves and the Africa Climate Foundation. And essentially, the first step with this group has been to develop a position paper called Pathways to Green African Industrialization, which we launched at the Africa Climate Summit in September last year. And I think these were the really high-level takeaways from that piece of work. These are all available on the Nelson Mandela School website, the reports that I refer to. The first is that often greening is seen as synonymous with what I would call poverty alleviation as distinct from poverty eradication. What I mean by that is that there's a lot of thinking about how development-related interventions that link with climate can ameliorate the conditions of people that are living somewhere slightly above or slightly below the World Bank $2 per day kind of poverty threshold. So the emphasis here is not on that. It's on how African countries, as others before them, have decisively eradicated poverty by moving to a situation where people are not, it's not around, are you just above or below the $2 a day line, but are you, do you have a population that the mean of which is earning, $10 a day, $20 a day, that, out of poverty. So that's the one. The second then is how to do that in a climate-compatible way. So how to do it in a climate-compatible way, but also in a way that has the developmental gains that are required to move towards the eradication of poverty. First observation is that it requires industrialization at scale. That obviously requires paying attention to kind of new green value chains that are most obviously associated with the green transition. So, electric vehicles, batteries, renewable energy components. One of the limitations, however, of just zoning in so much onto those subsectors is that they are very, very small. Even in South Africa, the most industrialized country on the continent, our own renewable energy master plan estimates that we only have about 2,500 people employed making renewable energy components. Now, I think that's a bit of an underestimate, but that's the kind of order of magnitude. So a major argument in the paper, in which I firmly advocate, is that we need to look beyond those narrow kind of sexy areas if we are serious about green industrialization and green structural transformation, and rather look to a much broader set of, in particular, labor-intensive and medium technology manufacturing sectors, as well as manufacturing-like activities that have similar characteristics. And in particular, particularly promising, I would argue, would be high-value agriculture or horticulture. I'll come back to this. A second is, an obvious point, is to harness the enormous renewable resources that the continent has, that countries on the continent have, for low-carbon industrialization. Now, for maybe five or so countries, they have a decarbonization problem. But for the bulk of countries on the continent, I would argue that there's an electrification and an industrialization problem. That is the predominant problem. They're contributing marginally to greenhouse gases. The arguments in the paper about why it's not wise to swing to saying, well, let's just use the fossil fuels that we have instead of going this kind of green industrialization path. Not enough time to get into that. Thirdly, it's very important to harness trade, but also to be balanced about that. So there are significant opportunities to increase industrial capabilities and output and jobs through intra-African trade in certain value chains, certain products, but not, again, not to be blind to the opportunities to export to the rest of the world, particularly to high-income and high-growth markets of the North and the East. Very critical, it's come up a number of times today, is the need for domestic and regional financial mobilization. Why domestic and regional? Because the international commitments that have been made by the advanced economies are simply not materializing at the scale, in the form that is required. And even some of the better structured or more concessional parts of them bring with them macroeconomic risks and vulnerabilities, which we can perhaps pick up in the discussion. So the focus needs to be, number one, on there's this notion of a new African financial architecture, which is being driven by the African Development Bank or emerging out of the African Development Bank, about leveraging resources on the continent from pension funds, from other domestic and regional sources, as well as through country platforms. So this could be through national development banks, but also through various kinds of arrangements, even things like these just economic transition partnerships. So that's the big picture. This is a small and hard to read picture, which turns to, how can one begin to quantify and make sense of, where the green industrialization opportunities lie. So just to, I know this is almost impossible to read, but basically what this graph shows is that on the horizontal axis is labor intensity, the relative labor intensity of a whole range of sectors in the South African economy. Let me just go back. That's labor intensity, and then vertical is carbon intensity. So basically, the further towards the right, the more labor-intensive sectors are. Although this is actually a measure of the labor, not just intensity, but the stimulatory effects that different sectors have. And then vertically, the higher up you are, the lower carbon you are. So the sweet spot would seem to be then these sectors in quarter one, that's the top right quartile. And the problem areas are the sectors in quadrant 3 or quarter 3. So quarter 1, quite labor intensive, low carbon. Quarter 3, carbon intensive, low labor intensity. And then quarter 2 is a kind of intermediate where it's also somewhat low or below average carbon intensity, but not as labor intensive. And obviously this is not meant to be mechanistic, but but just to guide thinking. So the one way to think about this is to say, what manufacturing sectors that are significant in terms of the amount of people they're employed, which have lost jobs over a recent decade, and which have gained jobs? And what does that tell us about where some of the opportunities lie? So the manufacturing jobs have been lost, interestingly, and first of all, unsurprisingly, in this labor-intensive sector. So that's jobs that have been lost, for instance, in clothing and textiles and publishing. But interestingly, also in the capital-intensive sectors have been very big contributors to these job losses. And where have the sectors that increased manufacturing jobs been? They've been in the first of all in a number of the labor-intensive sectors, but also in the somewhat less labor-intensive but a relatively low carbon intensity sectors. There have been slightly more jobs that have been created than those that have been lost, which should give us a little bit of, that the picture is not entirely pessimistic.
And this is for South Africa?
This is South Africa, yeah. So where have we seen job losses? First of all, largely in the steel and structural metal sector. This should be no surprise. We know that public investment expenditure has been very low, and hence that has been a major driver. The paper and printing sector, textile and apparel, and then also parts of chemicals, basic chemicals. Where have jobs been created? Agro-processing, food and beverages, has created a significant number of jobs. Machinery and equipment, chemicals, rubber, plastics, and also very importantly, and this is not neatly included in these 4 quadrants, but the horticultural sector has created in excess of 100,000 jobs over this period. This is inferred because there are big data problems with trying to identify precisely how many jobs have been created in the horticulture sector. Most of those have been in the citrus sector. What does this mean for trying to quantify, strategize, even without models? I think this kind of analysis can be very useful in identifying where the gaps are, where the opportunities are, and also whether the relative emphasis of industrial policy has been in the right place. Now, if we go back and we look at recent industrial policy, I think one thing that's striking in South Africa is that industrial policy has mostly been focused on sectors that are in distress or sectors that have been facing significant difficulties. So clothing, steel, poultry, sugar. And there's been a lack of corresponding focus and set of sector strategies on these sectors that despite a weak economy, corruption, electricity problems, have still managed to generate significant numbers of jobs, and under better conditions and with more support could certainly arguably generate many more. So this is as much time as I have to spend on this. So what are the big takeaways I would say from this? Number one, let's have a much broader view of what we think about as green manufacturing or green structural transformation. Actually, we have the opportunities, not just in South Africa, across African countries. It's much wider than we think, and much wider than is being kind of conceptualized. Breaking this down into what has been happening with particular sectors, building on successes, not picking winners so much as working with winners or supporting winners, sectors that have a track record of creating jobs, as well as sectors where there's a reasonable prospect of reversing job losses, and linking that to the green economy. So we have a massive energy grid expansion program that is necessary in South Africa. This could be an enormous stimulus to reversing the job losses in the steel and fabricated steel product sector. So hopefully that's useful food for thought in terms of how to begin to approach these questions. And actually, it's not rocket science. Some very basic descriptive statistics can go a long way in providing some guidance towards industrial strategy. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. I think possibly the rocket science sits in scaling that up. So 150,000 jobs over 10 years is not very many. No. We need, across the continent, 50 million jobs, right? And so that's kind of a big challenge. I'm keen to hear maybe from you, Travis, to just reflect a little bit on these kinds of efforts in the United States. I think many of us are probably familiar with the IRA, but if you can talk a little bit about the IRA, and how does this extend down? Because IRA does seem like big bet stuff to me. Is there a strategy to think about broader downstream industrialization, creating more jobs?
Yeah, thank you. Feel free to redirect me if I don't get to the specific of IRA or anything you're thinking of. But one of the things I think around the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, is that it really was industrial policy. And it's one of the first and largest of industrial policies, I guess, in the United States. It's sort of in my lifetime. I guess we always have industrial policy. We always have R&D, funded through our National Science Foundation and such. But the IRA really was, it was blatant industrial policy for for the U.S. And it did a relatively good job of not picking winners per se. It set up a lot of tax structures for like low carbon technologies and things like that, without necessarily decreeing which technologies those were. But I think one of the interesting things around it was, and at least one of the things I'll talk about first around it is it was also a very much a pro-American stance, which I know got a lot of flack, being I think the only American in the room. It's like I've heard a lot around our current geopolitical situation in the last couple of days, but even back when I was traveling, shortly after the IRA, it ruffled a lot of feathers because it was a pro-American, buy American domestic demand. And I know on your first slide, Nimrod, and I think Mark said it earlier today around the procurement of I think it was Mark that mentioned that no South African countries can get in on the transmission projects. Yeah. That was not the IRA approach. The IRA approach was buy American, invest in American batteries, invest in a lot of technologies. And I name that because it's really important, I think, when thinking around industrial demand, is to think around, green growth and industrial transformation is to really think about your domestic demand. That's something that the U.S. focused on with this policy. It's something that China, another country that we've worked a fair amount in, of course, has its domestic demand to drop back on when there is such a thing. When exports are lagging or something like that. When the international solar panel market was getting a little bit flooded because of Chinese solar panels, of course they just said, okay, we'll just install a whole bunch domestically. And there's that kind of demand drive. So I think that that's one of the things that the IRA did particularly, at least was interesting from my perspective. Now, a lot of what the IRA has been rolled back in one way, shape, or another under the Trump administration. But the projects are, the things that were funded, they tried pumping the money out as quickly as possible under the Biden administration. And a lot of those projects are still online. A lot of the cement that was poured is still there. So those types of projects and on-the-ground things were kind of irreversible. But the policies I think are, and Trump, from my knowledge, did not roll back the domestic purchasing type of thing too.
Mm. Yeah, thanks. I mean, it does raise an interesting point about how we think about demand. And I often have conversations with people about, South Africa should focus on battery manufacturing or solar panel manufacturing. And I'm like, oh, can we really compete with China? Like, will we actually be competitive? And then you have things like CBAM. So for those of you who don't know CBAM, it's a sort of EU trade measure to protect their industries. Like, how do you think about that, Nimrod? Like, most of what I see in the literature is trade-led industrialization. But it seems like those days are gone, right? And that you have to have something else. But I have no idea what that something else is. I don't know if you do.
Willing to give it a shot. Yeah, I think on the first question, I think it does require a lot of thinking about, for instance, renewable energy componentry. My own view is that, for instance, on producing the silicone, which goes into producing solar panels, the wafers, the cells, unless you are able to invest in gigafactories with absolutely enormous economies of scale and subsidized electricity for the silicone, the chances of competing with China on something like solar PV panels is very, very unlikely to be successful. Having said that, there are areas along the value chain where it is possible to add value and create some jobs. Creating the panel modules, but further downstream in South Africa, the trackers and the mounting structures, and a lot of the kind of cabling and so on that goes into balance of plant in large utility scale renewable energy plants. But I think there's got to be very careful thinking about do you treat renewable energy as something you really want to hook your industrialization on and rely on that, or do you want to treat it more as a capital good, where you are aiming to take advantage of the fall in costs of renewable energy, of the subsidies that China has given to its own industry, and aim for cheap and rapid electrification based on renewable energy, which can underpin other sectors, industrialization of other sectors that have much stronger fundamentals in the context of one's own economy. And I'm saying in the South African context, I don't think those fundamentals are that strong for solar. I think, but it depends sector by sector. CBAM and is it trade-led? I think that wherever it is possible, having kind of export-oriented industrial policy is very, very beneficial. And there needs to be a balance between seeking to export and import replacement. It's not an either-or. If we look at where South Africa and a number of other African countries have managed to do very well, even under adverse conditions, it's in horticulture. Export along what is a very sophisticated and technology-intensive value chain to get fresh fruit into a supermarket, whether it's in Berlin or London or Shanghai, and that is generating a lot of value addition and creating a lot of jobs. We can debate the quality of those jobs, but it also it's an additional source of demand, particularly when you have weak domestic demand, and it also confronts the balance of payments constraint that developing countries face. If you can't export, you can't import the capital goods that are necessary to modernize your economy. So CBAM is obviously, again, a complex issue. It is a threat to our capital-intensive industries that export to Europe. And I think that the way that it was implemented is not fair. It doesn't follow international trade rules and so forth. Is it likely that we will get the Europeans to back off? I think it's unlikely. So that's the reality I think that we need to confront.
More of it from other countries.
Yeah, that certainly could be the case. And there are a whole lot of complex things that follow from that around how do you reorient these heavy industries that are very concentrated, not just in terms of industry structure, but corporate ownership, because it requires changing corporate strategy, and that is difficult.
Yeah, interesting. Travis, I saw you wanting to jump in.
I was just going to add that I think if you don't see other countries following lead with border adjustment type mechanisms, I think the one thing you're definitely going to see is a lot more linkages of carbon markets into the ETS, the European trading system, through, like, Brazil is thinking of doing it and other things. So I think by putting up a trade wall around Europe, I think you're creating demand for other linkages too. So.
Okay. And have you got any thoughts about the sort of methodological approach about how do we think about alternatives to export-led industrialization, but also just how do we think about that? What are the kinds of things we need to do?
So the Climate Policy Lab, it does have programs on green industrialization and supply chains. We're starting 2 or 3 new projects, several grants, I guess, really looking into this. I think the thing that we're hypothesizing, we don't have the answer. Short answer to your question, I don't have the answer yet.
No one does.
But we're hypothesizing that it's going to be hard for most, if not all, the other countries to really do growth that's sort of the China model export-led growth. We think that sort of like like Nimrod was saying, it's like China's doing many things very well. Like you used the example of solar panels. And so therefore, we're looking for other alternatives in growth models. We do think there are some analogies. We're going to be doing research, and one of the things we do is comparative policy analysis across regions. So we'll be looking at that, and that's part of our group. But I think that the balance of payments comment and you know the financial structure of so many countries, debt load and things like that, I think is another reason they have to look to alternative models.
Yeah. I mean, so we're rapidly running out of time. It's been a fascinating conversation. I mean, one of the things that we hear as an idea a lot is, you know, critical minerals are going to change the way geopolitics work. I mean, my personal view is we don't have enough as Africa of these materials for us to really change geopolitics if we act on our own. And so maybe part of this export-led, part of this kind of Africa Renaissance kind of thinking is, can we form as African countries like sellers blocks instead of buyers blocks? Like, we're all at the mercy of the buyer right now. You know, they set prices, and you see this across agriculture, critical minerals, conventional minerals. So yeah, just kind of your thoughts about, you know, in the idea of Mark earlier about thinking differently, of Deborah yesterday saying we've got to like do things differently, otherwise we're stuffed, to use the scientific phrase. You know, kind of what is your thinking on this kind of Africa alignment and block trade?
Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical about the ability of critical minerals and a number of other sectors that I think have been somewhat hyped up to really tackle the developmental problems and to act as a site of deep industrialization. But it really depends country by country. I mean, there are success stories on the continent, and then there are less successful cases. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking. You know, it would be fantastic if African countries were able to kind of combine, pool their resources into a kind of buyers club where collectively they have a significant share of critical minerals. I think that what's happening in practice is countries are struggling to manage their own political economy contestation and conflicts, and kind of mashing those together, and trying to manage that at a regional level is very, very difficult indeed. So I think the second point is that at the end of the day, it's about industrial capabilities. So adding value to critical minerals requires very sophisticated industrial capabilities to manufacture battery-grade concentrates. And so there's got to be a plan to build those industrial capabilities. So, for instance, implementing an export ban on primary commodities without having a plan in place to attract the investment one way or another to add value to those commodities is not a viable plan. But having said that, there are areas, I mean, there are success stories from the continent. I think Morocco is very, very interesting. They're a leader in phosphate production, which has historically been for fertilizer. And I think they are shifting some of those capabilities, and they are attracting investment, Chinese investment, even South Korean investment, into manufacturing of battery-grade critical minerals. Some of them linked to the phosphate deposits that they have, but some of them linked to other minerals as well. They also, I mean, it's not a connected value chain, but they're making quite a lot of progress in automotives and electric vehicles and components and so forth. There's there's a coherent strategy which is financed and supported. So, you know, I don't think it's about saying these things are not possible. I think it's simply saying, you know, with the, you know, kind of scan and survey what capabilities you have, what resources you have, you know, and say, from that, say, what can you realistically build from over the next 5 years, 10 years? I think that's a realistic strategy. I think learning from winners is a realistic strategy. So where the private sector does something, they demonstrate that something is possible. Support that sector. That's what Ethiopia did with cut flowers, for instance. You know, so I think that there really are enormous possibilities. A lot of them are in the whole agricultural and agro industry space, if I had to highlight a general area. And there's also ways in which one can capture value from minerals and redirect those rents towards other sectors. I mean, that's an option open. That's something that's available to African countries. You know, how do you tax minerals so that you can build, you know, a food and beverage sector, perhaps, or a textile sector, or whatever the case may be.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. We've unfortunately run out of time. That was a very interesting conversation, and I wish we had more time for that. Yeah, so thank you, Nimrod. Appreciate it. And thank you, Travis.